goals are for COP28?
A number of them. Certainly to ensure that we move forward, that we accelerate the fight against climate change, so that collectively we go further and faster when it comes to reducing the emissions of greenhouse gas emissions globally. And discussions like phasing out of unabated fossil fuels will be very important. There's discussion about agreeing together to tripling the amount of renewables globally by 2030, doubling energy efficiency. We will certainly be supportive of these things. There are a number of other issues, for example, on loss and damage, on adaptation to climate change, and also financing. How do we support transition around the world, more specifically in the global south, and how do we help them adapt to the impacts of climate change?
Will Canada have new deadlines? Will Canada have new deadlines, quicker deadlines than what we've already set, or will they be beyond 2035 or 2050?
So, not to be too technical about it, but the global stocktake that will take place for the first time. So, we start looking at the commitments we've made since Paris, what's working, what's not working. There's a public document out on that that's showing that some of the things are working, but we need to do better. New targets, new collective targets would come next year at COP29.
There's a lot of concerns about this meeting being held in the United Arab Emirates, and particularly accusations against the host for trying to break the private business interests in the oil sector as a part of this meeting. What do you say to the emissions?
I can tell you that I've had several meetings with the COP28 president-designate, at least half a dozen since last spring, and he's never spoken to me about oil deals. I mean, we've obviously talked about climate change and reducing our dependencies on fossil fuels and elements related to the negotiations, but never spoken about any deals he would want to make with Canada.
La présidente qui va là-bas, c'est pour quelle raison c'était important pour des leaders syndicaux de se rendre là-bas?
Écoutez, les syndicats participent depuis très longtemps aux discussions dans le cadre des conférences internationales sur le climat, notamment dans la perspective de la transition juste. Donc, comment on va s'assurer que les travailleurs qui sont les communautés qui sont dans les secteurs affectés vont être accompagnés vers les nouveaux emplois, les nouveaux secteurs de développement. Et je pense que très clairement, les syndicats ont un rôle à jouer. D'ailleurs, le Canada inclut des représentants et représentantes syndicales sur la délégation canadienne, tout comme les représentants de province, jeunes.
C'est juste que c'est un mauvais timing.
Le timing, je lui laisse ça.
Le fait que le Canada n'a pas encore dévoilé les cibles pour le secteur gazier et pétrolier, est-ce que ça nuit à la crédibilité du Canada sur la scène internationale dans un événement comme la COP28, par exemple? Tous ces délais.
En fait, moi, je ne partage pas votre opinion. Si vous regardez plusieurs des déclarations du dirigeant de l'Agence internationale de l'énergie qui a salué à plusieurs reprises le travail du Canada en matière de lutte au changement climatique, la présidente du Fonds monétaire international, je pourrais vous en nommer comme ça pendant longtemps, les gens reconnaissent. Moi, j'arrive pas à COP en disant au Canada, on a tout compris, on a tout bon. On a des défis au Canada, puis tout le monde a des défis, puis travaillons ensemble pour trouver des solutions à ces défis-là.
For leading oil, does that diminish Canada's international credibility on climate change?
It doesn't. We have one of the most robust carbon pricing system in the world, one that has been praised by many. I was talking about the leadership of the IEA, the IMF, and many others have praised Canada for our carbon pricing system, and our carbon pricing system is still very robust.
Can we just ask you about this development in the United States, where the U.S. District Attorney for New York has arrested and charged an Indian national with the attempted murder of a U.S. citizen on soil there, and a government of India official apparently is complicit in that. Have you had some communication about that? Does that reflect on the Jar case?
So we've been aware of these investigations since last summer. The RCMP, CSIS, and other Canadian law enforcement agencies have been working with their American counterparts, obviously on the case of the murder of Mr. Nijjar. We've taken note of the indictment filed in the U.S. Courts. These are ongoing criminal investigations, and in the case of the United States, judicial proceedings. So we won't comment on individual cases, obviously, except to say that there is a very, very high level of collaboration between the RCMP, the FBI, between CSIS, other intelligence partners in the United States. I was briefed on this as recently as last evening. And this confirms what our government has said for a long time, that any threat to a Canadian citizen by a foreign government or by some transnational criminal organization needs to be met with a strong law enforcement response. I have every confidence in the case of the ongoing murder investigation in British Columbia that the RCMP are doing the rigorous, important work that we expect of them, and we're going to let them conclude their investigation with respect to the murder of a Canadian citizen.
En français, s'il vous plaît, en français. Pouvez-vous le répéter juste en français? Juste une fois en français, s'il vous plaît.
La caméra est où?
OK,
alors, évidemment, nous avons pris connaissance de qu'est-ce qui a été déposé devant les tribunaux aux États-Unis. C'est un sujet avec lequel nous sommes impliqués depuis l'été passé. Moi-même, j'étais renseigné aussi récemment que hier soir par les hauts dirigeants de la GRC et du service de renseignement quant à leur enquête qui est en cours en Colombie-Britannique avec l'assassinat d'un citoyen canadien. Ça confirme qu'est-ce que nous avons dit depuis le début, que c'est essentiel pour les agences du gouvernement du Canada de travailler avec des partenaires aux États-Unis, précisément pour protéger les citoyens canadiens. C'est complètement inacceptable qu'ils soient menacés, surtout par un État étranger ou une organisation internationale criminelle. Les forces de l'ordre du Canada sont très impliquées dans ces enquêtes-là. Ils vont continuer de l'être. Moi, j'ai pleine confiance dans la GRC, dans les services de renseignement et de sécurité du Canada, de faire le travail qui s'impose, et on va laisser leurs enquêtes se poursuivre.
Mr. On that issue, can you please clarify, because the Indian High Commissioner was on CTV this weekend saying that your government has provided much less detail, much less information than the American government has to them, and that's why the Indian government is cooperating with the U.S. in a way that it is not with Canada. Can you please clarify what detail and the specificity of the evidence provided to India? And how does it differ from the U.S.?
Well, so I'm obviously not going to discuss the details of what evidence has or hasn't been handed over by a Canadian police agency to an international partner. What I can say is that our expectation, and the Prime Minister said this in his first comments in September about this, is that the Indian government be fully engaged with Canadian law enforcement in this investigation.
Is the High Commissioner wrong in that Canada has not provided the detail?
I can't speak for the High Commissioner. What I can tell you is that the Canadian law enforcement agencies with whom I have conversations tell me they are still waiting for the Indian government to be more engaged in the Canadian investigation.
Right, but have they given information for India to act on? Because India says it doesn't have the information needed to act on.
And I've encouraged the Canadian law enforcement agencies to continue to insist on that level of engagement from their partners in India.
Why do you think that the U.S. response was different? Why do you think the response to the U.S. investigation was different?
Again, these are ongoing criminal investigations, so I'm not in a position to discuss the details of what information the police have or didn't have or are searching for.
But why did
what
India
I can
respond
say,
differently?
Again, I don't speak for the government of India, but what I can say is that the Canadian law enforcement agencies have been very, very much engaged with their American counterparts in these investigations. The Prime Minister said in September that we had credible intelligence of a potential link between the government of India. And I think what was filed in a U.S. court today confirms that Canada is not alone at managing these particular threats. What's important for us is that the Government of Canada and agencies like the RCMP and the Intelligence Service do everything that they can to protect Canadians, but also to hold accountable those that murdered a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil.
Why was the U.S. able to foil the plot there while Canadians were not able to do that?
Again, you'd ask me to speculate on the details of a police operation or an intelligence operation in an ongoing murder investigation. So, Rafi, I'm not trying to be difficult, but the worst thing that I could do would be to speculate or comment on the details of police or intelligence operations in a way that might prejudice their ability to hold those to account, those who committed the murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. So we'll be careful. All of those questions will be answered at the appropriate moment by the law enforcement agencies.
You think law enforcement's going to tell us
when
that
they
they
get.
screwed up?
the law enforcement agencies will continue to do the important work that I think they're doing well, and all of those questions are answered in the appropriate processes, including court processes, like we saw today in the United States.
Les autres ministères par rapport aux employés, aux fonctionnaires qui ont des commentaires antisémites ou bien islamophobes, est-ce qu'il y a des directives qui ont été envoyées sur des suspensions avec salaire, sans salaire? C'est quoi les politiques que vous avez?
Quel est le problème?
Camille Awada, l'ancien président de Kay. Qu'est-ce qui se passe avec lui? Est-ce qu'il a été suspendu avec salaire, sans salaire, de la fonction publique fédérale?
Ça, c'est une chef de file d'un syndicat, n'est-ce pas?
Oui, sauf que c'est un employé, c'est un fonctionnaire de Statistique Canada à la base.
Mais je n'ai pas l'autorité ou le rôle avec le leadership de syndicat.
Okay, but what are the policies for the public servants? The public servants.
On peut parler français.
Oui,
On peut
mais
parler
les
français.
fonctionnaires qui émettent des commentaires comme ceux-là, est-ce que c'est suspendu avec salaire, sans salaire? C'est quoi la politique? C'est quoi les directives qui ont été envoyées?
Au Conseil de Trésor, nous avons l'autorité, la responsabilité de mettre en œuvre les politiques, les directives. Et c'est nécessaire de s'assurer qu'il y a des règles là pour les fonctionnaires. Mais au sujet de l'enforcement, ça veut dire une responsabilité de chaque département. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Right now, the divestment process to actually unload a piece of federal land requires us to comply with the constitutional duty to consult where there may be Indigenous interests, and then we have to offer properties to provincial governments and then municipal governments, and then we can go to the private market if a property is destined that way.
Is that too long?
Yes, it takes too long. Though the fact of the matter may be we can still meet the schedule under the Federal Lands Initiative we established a few years ago, we're looking at ways to speed up the process and looking at unique solutions that maybe allow us to shrink that timeline. I have had a number of meetings with the President of the Treasury Board and Minister Duclos as well to determine a new path forward to dispose of federal lands. In the meantime, for properties that we have in the pipeline, we do want to continue to use the existing process to get the ones down that are close to being across the goal line, but we're looking at new processes to speed up the divestment process for federal lands more broadly.
One more question on this. Sometimes it seems like politicians think of this process, transforming federal land or federal buildings into housing, as kind of like a simple, easy solution. Is it as easy as people think?
It depends on the specific piece of property. Across the portfolio, it's actually quite complicated. So the federal government owns lots of land, and making land available for affordable housing can reduce the input costs, and we should pursue it. A lot of federal land are in places that do not have access to services. A lot of federal lands are not appropriate for environmental reasons for housing developments. But when we create an inventory of the lands that are appropriate to build housing, we should be using that for housing in a housing crisis. We do have a constitutional obligation to consult Indigenous communities, and we do want to ensure that we have a fair process to understand that lands are actually going to be made available for housing in a timely way. It may not be as simple as people think, but it does provide a unique opportunity for us to reduce the input cost to build more affordable housing over time.
Can I ask one quick question?
I'll come back.
What's your reaction to more polls are showing more Canadians are increasingly questioning Canada's immigration, given the economic housing situation we're in? What is your reaction to that?
Immigration remains one of Canada's biggest economic advantages. We're dealing with a very different scenario than existed 50 years ago when we had 7 workers for every retired person. Today that number is a little better than 3. In my region, in Atlantic Canada, it's closer to 2 workers for every retired person. What we've seen in my own community when I first became a member of Parliament was so many young people were moving away that we were actually losing hospitals and hospital services and schools in my community. We've seen a different challenge now. As people move in, we do have growth-oriented challenges around building housing and healthcare in particular, and we need to make sure we're going to build out the absorptive capacity of communities to take advantage of the economic opportunity that immigration represents. I do think there are challenges not with the permanent residency programs and the numbers that the government sets, but with some of the demand-driven programs around temporary residency for temporary foreign workers, for international students. I believe we need to work with institutions, including colleges and universities, to put some of the responsibility on those who benefit from these programs financially to cover some of the costs of making sure there's adequate housing for them.
Can I ask?
I said I'd come to David. I'll come back.
It's a bit of a curveball question.
Okay.
So I've been speaking to
I'd expect nothing less.
Okay, good. Here it is. So I've been speaking to some members of your party who say
if the day should ever come that your party needs a new leader, they think you might make a credible leadership candidate. I'm curious about your thoughts about that.
Look, first of all, let's dispense with the obvious. That job ain't open right now. There's a guy who has done an awful lot for the communities that I represent, who I continue to support and will support until he decides the time is done for him. My own perspective and the advice that I pass on to any school group I talk to young people generally, is you shouldn't focus on what job you want to have, focus on the problems you want to solve. I didn't get into politics to be the minister of this or that, to hold a particular portfolio. I get into politics to create jobs for my region in Atlantic Canada. I got into politics to advance environmental policies. I got into politics to make sure that we're able to do more for people regardless of whether their parents were wealthy. If we can continue to have an impact on those problems, to me, it does not matter what job I have, it matters what difference I can make.
But Radio Canada has confirmed that the government has decided to move forward with a sole source contract for billions of dollars or to replace Canada's aging military surveillance planes. Why move forward with a sole source contract in this case?
Look, I haven't seen the official reports. I want to be careful about conversations that I may have had to respect the confidentiality for the portfolios that some of my colleagues have and the discussions we have in Cabinet. So I'll apologize in advance for not giving you an answer on that one, but I'd suggest dealing with my colleagues who are responsible for the portfolio.
What can you say broadly about it?
That we want to make sure that we continue to get value for money. To the extent we have an opportunity to do that on a given portfolio, the exact process to ensure we get timely access to the gear that we need to provide the services and the capability that we need. I think it's important that we design the process appropriately in those instances, but I would defer to my colleagues responsible for the portfolio.
Okay, yeah, because
Fraser, a question in regards to affordable housing. So you're under the RHI, there's 15,500 units that have already been earmarked for a $4 billion fund. But 15,500 versus more than 170,000 units which have already been created or seeded through the Rapid Housing Initiative. So the Housing Accelerator Fund. Both are $4 billion. Why the discrepancy? Why are you able to do 170,000 units seeding for one or half for $2 billion less than, but only 15,500 for the RHI?
Great question. Indulge me, this will take 1 minute to explain.
Okay.
When we're dealing with affordable housing projects, the federal government is contributing to the cost of constructing the buildings. It's very expensive to build housing, but we need to continue to make the investments that will build out non-market stock if we want to avoid challenges with a shortage of affordable housing, which translates into problems around homelessness for communities. We must do it. We made mistakes 30 years ago in Canada that were continued across successive Liberal and Conservative governments that led us to the situation we're in now. We can't stop investing in non-market housing. It's essential and we must continue. With the Housing Accelerator Fund, we don't actually pay for the construction of new homes. We're creating incentives by putting federal funding on the table for municipalities to implement systemic reforms, primarily around municipal zoning, primarily around incentives to get construction going, and primarily around the permitting process. What we actually see is the systemic reforms provide intense value for money from the federal government's point of view, because if you can actually change the zoning practices that allow an apartment complex to be put up near a transit station for a relatively small cost, you can actually see more apartment buildings put up. Addressing the supply challenge is absolutely essential, and we need to do it by tackling not just affordable housing, not just market housing, but also reforms at the municipal level, and we get great value for money that way.
So in a situation when there are going to be record numbers of homeless people using shelters, without the RHI, now that the $4 billion has been already earmarked, where will there be new money for shelters, for homeless, for affordable housing, low-income housing for vulnerable populations?
Yeah, the answer is an unequivocal yes. In fact, the fall economic statement included more than $1.3 billion for non-market housing. $1 billion through the Affordable Housing Fund, more than $300 million for cooperative housing. We need to continue to make these investments, and there is still some money that remains in existing programs, though as that money starts to be diminished, seeing that re-injection of capital to show that we're going to remain in the space is extremely important. Over and above those very specific programs that have been recapitalized, the next tranche of funding for communities through the Reaching Home program is going to be landing soon. We're going to continue to make the investments necessary to play a role in the space of building affordable housing.
The private sector is not investing in low-income housing for homeless, and neither are cities and municipalities. Like the federal government had to fork out $4 billion to to build those houses from scratch?
So cities and provinces do contribute as well. To be clear, this is not me saying that they don't play a role. They have an important role to play. You may even say they have a primary role to play, but we've made a decision with the adoption of the National Housing Strategy that we want to be a part of the solution as well. The Fall Economic Statement communicated that we're still going to be playing a role. When it comes to affordable non-market housing, governments absolutely are going to have to be driving the agenda. The private sector interests are going to continue to build homes in the market, and we need to incentivize market-based homes so more middle-class families have a place to live, because we need to create an equilibrium between supply and demand. The way that we're doing that is by putting tax incentives on the table with the removal of the GST. We're also introducing low-cost financing opportunities in exchange for commitments for builders who benefit from the rate of borrowing the federal government can pass on to actually put homes on the market at prices that are at and below what the market will bear. So we're actually bringing down the cost of apartments in a given market in Canada by putting that low-cost financing in exchange for commitments at price levels through the apartment construction loan program. There's many aspects to this. We need to address supply to bring rents down overall, but we need to make direct investments in affordable housing to make sure those who can't afford a home still have a roof over their head and don't run into some of the challenges that we see in communities who are dealing with a homelessness crisis. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Yeah, appreciate it.
I'm asking you some questions in your capacity as the co-chair of the campaign.
That works.
And it sort of stems from, I won't say, sources say, we know the Prime Minister is not going to quit as leader. He's very keen to lead the party in the next election. And he's very confident that, given 2 years, some of these numbers we're seeing can be turned around and you can bring Canadians back. So the million-dollar question for you as a campaign chair, I assume you share the same faith. How do you do that? Is there some particular regions, issues? How are Liberals going to sort of build back some more support among Canadians?
Well, the first thing we have to say is that we recognize that people are going through tough times. And there's an anxiety and frustration for many reasons out there. Reasons domestically, reasons abroad. And we have to, acknowledge that emotion. But as a government, you have to stay focused. And you have to stay focused on and doing the right thing. And sometimes doing the right thing is not necessarily what people want to hear. And as a government, we are going to stay focused, staying focused on delivering on our Fall Economic Statement, delivering on affordability, and keeping that track. Because I think at some point, authenticity, being truthful about who we are as a government, will give a path to Canadians around, okay, this government has my back, even though I'm not being in the right position in terms of my emotions right now, and I get that. I mean, in my own writing, I can see that. So I think for me, as a co-chair, is making sure that as government and as MPs, we stay focused and deliver for Canadians in that sense.
Certainly in 2015, and I would say in the last 2 elections, that the party has sort of lived and died by the leader. I mean, Justin Trudeau was a definite asset, no question about it. May or may not be now, we can argue about that. But for the next campaign, remain the focus on the leader, or perhaps feature some other players and leaders within the government and within the party? What do you think about that?
Well, the first thing I would say about that is that I know our PM, our Prime Ministers, for many years, even before he was a Prime Minister, when he ran for his own nomination in Papineau, and he's always been underestimated. And our Prime Minister, other than just being, I think, a great Prime Minister for this country, he's a fighter. He's always been a fighter. He's one of the great campaigners that I've met in my life, and I would not underestimate him on the next campaign. That being said, I think we have a great team now, too, and people can see that. I think Canadians will see other players on this team being part of this government, and I want to be sure that we'll be there for the next, the next mandate, and making sure that we'll continue to deliver what Canadians need. And I think, we have to not only focus on our leader, but be there for him as a team, and that's, I think, what we're going to do next time around.
The other thing that's been notable over the last all the Liberal campaigns since Justin Trudeau became leader, is a real hesitancy to be negative, to take on attack acts. And yet, last month, for the first time ever, we've seen the Liberal Party engage in paid social media ads. Call them what you want, negative, highlight ads, but definitely ads to tell Canadians about your chief opponent, Mr. Poilievre. Is that an important component?
What's important to do, it's making sure that Canadians know who the candidates are. And if the candidate is not being truthful to Canadians, we have to make sure that we show who he is. He voted against the free trade agreement with Canada and Ukraine. He used hashtag misogynist, hashtag. He has people in his Conservative Party that don't believe for the woman to choose. So we need to make sure that we show that. And that's also our responsibility.
Last question about Quebec, because in Quebec it's a different geometry. You yourself in your riding, if it's not you, it's probably going to be a Bloc Québécois candidate. So what do Liberals in Quebec say to prevent them from choosing M. Blanchet or one of his candidates?
One of the things that I've said all the time when I run in my own riding, and I continue to say, I think Quebec have a great team of MPs that are from Quebec. They're Liberals, they are from Quebec. We're 35 MPs from Quebec. And we are at the table, and we're making decisions, and we are working with the government of Quebec on behalf of Quebec. And I think the difference with the Bloc, and that and I've said it many times, is that we're there for Quebecers, and we're actually at the table, and we're going to be working with the government of Quebec, which the Bloc will never be able to see that.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ce que je comprends, c'est que le ministre Duclos pourra s'adresser aux médias et pourra lui-même vous donner la décision du gouvernement. Merci.
Should we just ask you to follow up on what happened yesterday? Do you have any regrets about posting that tweet following?
No, I do not. No, the intention there was to plant the seed and to really mark out the fact that Mr. Poilievre is engaging in very dangerous behavior. Behavior that is toxic right across the country. I did not make any connection between him and the event in Winnipeg, except to say that he's creating an environment through his toxicity where some people are going to give themselves permission to do antisocial things. So no, I don't regret that at all. I planted the seed. Reasonable people will think about that.
What are the policies for called by the House leader and did she ask you to apologize?
Yes, she said it'd be a good idea just simply because of the suggestion that there was a linkage, which there wasn't. But if I left any notion that there was a linkage, then that was unacceptable on my part, which is why I apologized to her.
So you're suggesting that you didn't want to say that Mr. Poilievre was directly involved in that
heavens
incident,
no.
But you were suggesting that things he's done led to that incident?
What I'm suggesting, and not suggesting, I'm saying, is that he is trying to create an environment in Canada that gives people permission to do things that are very antisocial. You remember he was delivering coffee to the convoy. Have a look at Pat King's videos and what he's talking about, because Pat King was one of the leaders of that convoy. And you tell me that that's the sort of thing that any responsible leader would actually, support or aid or abet?
But what does the convoy have to do with an incident in Winnipeg?
What I'm saying is that it's the environment that the Conservative leader is creating through his consistent misrepresentations and the use of the big lie technique. That environment leads to a rise in all kinds of things that are just simply not good for our society. Now, yes, the Winnipeg one, totally different thing. Mr. Poilievre, like any reasonable person, would have had nothing directly to do with that. But it's the environment that's being created by the politics that he practices. That's what we really have to be concerned about. Now, I have to go in there.
Mr. Hardeep, this has been going on for months. Why are you coming out with this kind of language now? It's like you raising concerns about this environment today versus...
Well, actually, I have been over a period of time, but this one got a lot of attention. There you are.
I just wanted to understand, first of all, on COP, what deliverable is Canada expecting from it? I understand there's sort of broad themes, but particularly for you, for the country, what exactly should Canadians be expecting for you to announce there?
To announce, well, I mean, there's a number of things we said we wanted to do by the end of the year. New methane regulations to ensure that the oil and gas sector reduces greenhouse gas emissions by at least 75% by 2030, which is one of the most ambitious targets in the world, and the Prime Minister has already announced that. The framework for the oil and gas cap, Prime Minister said that we would announce this by the end of the year. The COP would be a very good moment to be doing that. And we're in the final miles of completing our final zero-emission vehicle regulations, which I hope to be to have out the door by the end of the year.
So will all of those three be announced at COP?
I don't know.
You don't know? Because, for example, on the oil and gas emissions,
yes,
the cap, your government's already late on making decisions on that. You were supposed
Why
to announce,
we late?
You were supposed to announce a plan in early 2023, by spring 2023, of the carbon price versus cap and trade system, right?
No, we never said that.
Yeah.
We had a consultation document that and said one of
You
the
told my
possibilities.
paper that it would be in early 2023.
I said I would like that. There are many things I like, and I don't always get my way.
My point is that 2 years ago, the Prime Minister announced the oil and gas cap at COP. Last year you said it was coming in early 2023. It's now the end of 2023 and we haven't seen it yet. I know you say it's coming, but I guess the point is, like, it seems kind of nebulous what comes from this trip for you and what Canadians should expect. Like, why not stay here and focus on implementation rather than going abroad and talking about sort of big plans while we haven't gotten our own plans in place?
Well, we have a lot of our plans in place. In fact, the plan that I presented last year showed that we're 75% of the way to meeting our 2030 targets. In the last year and a half, we've announced clean fuel standards. We've announced draft regulations for net zero grid by 2035. We've announced draft regulations for the zero-emission vehicle. We phased out fossil fuels, the only country in the G20 to do that. We've done a number of things. There are other things that remains to be done. And why go to COP? Because we can't solve climate change on our own. We're condemned to work together. It's a global problem, and no one country can do it alone.
And so on the caps, you said it would be a good time to announce it at COP.
Yes.
Like, you don't know that it will happen, but you're hinting it will.
I'm hoping, it's looking good, but I can't give you a date.
But in the next 2 weeks, I guess.
The safe assumption, since the COP lasts about 2 weeks.
And so on that, have you decided what type of mechanism it is? Like, how will this be the final cap, or is this going to be draft that will go back to
So what the Prime Minister has announced is that we would present a framework of the cap for the oil and gas, which precedes the tabling of the. We don't table draft regulations, but the presentation of the draft regulations.
So what does that mean? So
we did the same thing for the electricity regulations.
So you'll be announcing the plan, but not yet the regulations.
The framework is basically a plain language document that gives you the main elements that you will find in the regulation, but it's not written in a regulatory form.
And is it still possible for it to be effective as of 2025, given that that's only in a year?
Those details will be known in the very near future.
Okay, and then more broadly, I mean, Alberta would be in the crosshairs of that announcement as well. You already have fights with them over electricity. There's a fight with the prairies in particular over the exemption for farmers. I mean, is this not... Why do you still need to go ahead with this cap despite the opposition from Alberta?
Because we need to do it. If we don't put in place the cap on oil and gas emissions, we can't achieve our 2030 targets. Canada can contribute to the way we should to the global effort in fighting climate change. And if we needed a reminder of the impacts of climate change, I think the summer of 2023 was a clear and stark reminder of that. And the more we wait, the more we delay action on climate change, the more people will suffer in Canada and all around the world from the impacts of climate change.
And so how will you navigate or manage that relationship with Alberta?
Well, we talk to them. We've been consulting not only the Alberta government, but governments across the country, companies and stakeholders, Indigenous nations across the country. We will continue to do that. On electricity, we already have 2 provinces that have come on board, 2 provinces that are still very dependent on fossil fuels for their electricity production. So it can be done. I mean, Alberta, the Premier has decided to take a very confrontational and frankly, non-fact-based position on the clean electricity regulation. There's no cliff in 2035. If you have a natural gas plant, you're operating natural gas plant, you will be allowed to use them as per the draft regulations. There's a number of things that the Premier says that are simply false. I would hope that she can engage in a constructive discussion as opposed to inflammatory comments that are not based in facts.
Okay, and last question, because I know you got to go. The oil and gas cap, it's going to be capped at one level and then gradually become tighter, right? So by 2030, what is the expectation of emissions reductions from that for the plan?
Well, you had a sense of what the sector needs to do in the emissions reduction plan from last year. Will the cap be exactly that? We'll have to see, but the emissions reduction plan gave a sense of direction.
That's sort of like the
sense of scale.
Or the scale. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Alors, sur le contrat avec Boeing et Bombardier, est-ce que c'est juste pour le Québec de dire qu'il ne pourra pas, enfin pas Québec, excusez-moi, est-ce que c'est juste de dire que Bombardier ne pourra pas soumissionner sur l'appel d'offres?
Je voudrais dire une chose. Toutes les rencontres du cabinet et du comité du cabinet sont confidentielles. Nous devons maintenir la confiance de nos membres et de nos processus. Donc, j'ai aucune à dire maintenant. Ce n'est pas correct. Actually, what I was saying was that all of the deliberations of Cabinet and of Cabinet committees are confidential at all times. And it is a matter of process and a matter of propriety and a matter of law. And it is for that reason that I have nothing further to say on this matter. Thank you.
Okay, what do you think about moving the Science Centre? The Ford government is moving the Science Centre to Ontario Place, out of Scarborough. You're a Scarborough MP. What do you think about that?
Is it technically out of Scarborough? I'm not sure.
Anyway,
I'm not sure.
is it
It's
North
Don
York?
Mills, Don Mills, yeah.
Don Mills, okay,
then I don't have any opinion.
But nonetheless, the moves that's happening, and then also, the Gardner DVP changes that we're seeing, all local issues for you.
Yeah. I'm not, that's the Faustian bargain between Mayor Chow and Mr. Ford. I don't think any of us are wildly enthusiastic about the Ontario line. I don't think anybody is wildly enthusiastic about moving the Ontario Science Centre. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I think it's a pretty successful science centre. And as far as I can see, it serves its purpose and is a good institution.
The municipal and provincial governments were looking for federal help. They had a long lobby campaign trying to get money out of Mr. Freeland. It never came, and they ended up with this deal. Why do you think there was no federal funds involved in this, and do you agree with that?
Stay tuned.
What do you know? Tell me all about it.
Not right now. Okay.
Mr. McKee, what do you think about the idea of giving Boeing a sole source contract for replacing the old fleet?
Well, again, those are subject to negotiations currently with the department. Well, who's to say that it's done? What I do know is that the military needs an airplane, and they need it now. And that is a very significant factor. I also know that politicians, by and large, should not weigh in on procurement decisions about which they know nothing. So I leave it to the experts, but I do know that the military is pretty keen.
But do you think there should have been a call for tenders?
Do I think, as long as they follow the process, it's fine by me. You can always obviate the process if you feel that there's a change in circumstances that makes it necessary.
The military also seems to be raising some serious concerns about the state of Canada's Navy today. Have you read those concerns?
I haven't read the report, but I probably agree with it. We have major concerns in the not only the ability of the force to do what we're asking it to do. Canadians are not engaged, which really frustrates me. You as journalists are not engaged, which frustrates me. We have, in the last 2 years, have had a dramatic change in the threat environment, and we are on a personnel basis, and on an equipment basis, not ready to meet the threat environment. General Air has been expressing that repeatedly, but frustrates me that we have underinvested in defense, in development, in diplomacy, and in ourselves. And the latest stupid event was that we cut back on the amount of money that was available for members of Parliament to travel. We got to be there. If you want more of Canada, Canada's got to show up.
Yeah, I thought you already come through.
Just a second, just to chat about how you guys are doing in Quebec these days. We have a new poll that says for the first time the Bloc is ahead, and I'm just wondering how you and other Quebec MPs are feeling about federal Liberal fortunes these days.
Well, I mean, we're all continuing to do our door-to-doors and connecting with our constituents. Obviously, I would say all Canadians have concerns for different reasons, and they're sharing those with us, and we're working very hard as a Quebec caucus to address those concerns, make sure that our voice is heard, and then find solutions to make sure that we can improve in their quality of life.
We find when I look at things, Quebecers have some very different priorities than the rest of the country, primarily when it comes to things around climate change. Like this is, CAC, I don't care who it is. Conservatives in Quebec, they're down with the climate change program. But maybe not so much in the rest of the country. I just wondered if that am I right on that?
I would disagree with you on that. I think that most Canadians, the vast majority of Canadians, want to see action on climate change. They want to see the federal government take action on climate change. That's what we're doing. I will agree with you, though. It does resonate more in Quebec. Quebecers want to see us take even greater action, even though we're doing more than any other government in history is doing. But they want us to continue and keep our pedal to the floor, and that's what we're going to keep doing.
And to continue on the logic, a party that doesn't have a credible climate change program and is not seen in Quebec as being aggressive on that is probably not going to find a lot of electoral success. You can sort of see where I'm going with that, right?
From what I'm hearing at the doors is they're not going to vote Conservative because the Conservatives aren't serious on climate change, and until they become serious on climate change, they're not even a contender.
I think that's an interesting observation. Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Okay, have a good talking to you. Can I just chat in a second just about Liberal political fortunes in Canada? Have things improved in your sense after that carve-out on the carbon tax? What do you think? Are people giving you more time of the day and patting you on the back and saying, I'm back in your corner? What's your sense?
The making the heat pumps available and pausing the carbon price has been received extremely well in the riding of Halifax. I'll just speak to my own riding. So it's created the opportunity for access to a tremendous number of households, and I think overall it's been a very, very positive thing. It took a little bit of explaining, of course, but it's once people understand that we're going to reach our targets for reduction of GHGs sooner and in a way that creates real options for homeowners, then they're very happy with it. And as we saw, the Ecology Action Centre gave it a very strong endorsement, which was a powerful endorsement.
Do you have a heat pump by any chance?
I do.
Okay, right on.
And wood stove backup.
Great.
Do you mind if I ask you a couple questions? I just want to know, in terms of your constituency, are there concerns about the fact that they are not getting as much news, either like obviously from Meta, but possibly from Google now that the deadline's coming up?
It hasn't come to my office once. No reaction in our inbox or even on the street about this.
Are you able to get information out? Do you worry about that in terms of losing those links?
My advice when people ask about credible sources of news is to stay away from social media anyway, and to go right to the sources.
Google searching for news.
This hasn't been a concern. I don't have anything to offer you there. This hasn't been raised with me as any kind of a concern.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Just wonder how, since the heat pump carve-out announcement was made, what's the reaction up in Cape Breton? Are people saying, way to go, Liberals, we're back on the Liberal team? I mean, is it sort of made life a little easier for you? What's been the reaction?
I mean, it's been well received. People have reached out and talked about the mechanics of it now in terms of, the rolling out of it. But overall, it's been received. People like my mom, who's 83, who lives in Glace Bay by herself, is oil heat is someone that is kind of a typical Cape Bretoner, and that is waiting for that transition, but needs the ability to make that transition. So, and that's across the country. So, I think it's being well received. But like everything else, the next part comes with the execution of the program, and that's what I'll be focused on.
And when you're doing your door knocking, are people asking about Conservatives and Democrats? If quote, there was an election, who might you be worried about up there?
You know what? Right now, I mean, everyone is talking about affordability. So it's not necessarily party. It's about what are you doing in Ottawa to address the middle class, the working class? How do we get prices down on food? A big thing in my riding, it's around Bill C-49. That's amendments to the Atlantic Accord that will enable green hydrogen and offshore wind. And actually, Cape Breton is poised to be a leader if everything falls into place. And the delaying of that bill is something that's on the minds of a lot of Cape Bretoners in northeastern Nova Scotia.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Thank you.